The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Thank you for joining us today here on FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. If you've been following the election here on FRC Media, we've produced plenty of content to make sure that you are ready when you go to the polls, either before or on November 5th. And we've run a couple of programs, 3 previous to today, that focus primarily on this year's presidential race. Well, today, we're going to present and produce our final version of our presidential election series. And I'm pleased to be joined, as we have throughout the entire series, of the Associate Professor of History and Government here at Bristol Community College, Don Kilguss, who's joining us again. Don, thanks for joining me. How are you?
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
You know, we've spoken a lot over the past 3 editions of our series, and people can actually watch those because in those times, I believe we started sometime in mid-June. Obviously, a lot changed throughout the presidential campaign. We want to sort of put a cap on things in this final edition. I actually want to start, if we could, maybe a little after Labor Day. There was the one and only presidential debate between former President Trump and Vice President Harris, where the two sides had the opportunity to start to lay out the issues for the remainder of the campaign. And I actually want to focus on the issues that the two candidates have been bringing up since that time. Let's start, Don, talk a little bit about what Vice President Harris has been trying to focus on in her campaign.
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, this has been a very unique election. I think that's putting it mildly, between 2 assassination attempts, obviously a Kennedy, in the race. You've had a former president running who's now been convicted as a convicted felon. You've also got, for example, a sitting president who was basically, different words you want to use, ousted might be one of the words you use, and then someone who came in as a replacement who didn't run in the primaries for the first time in 50 years. We will not have one of the candidates who actually won a single vote in the primary process itself. So this election has been incredibly interesting and unique in so many different ways. For Vice President Harris, for example, she has always, as vice presidents do, a very, very difficult path to when she's running for office like this, because you have the sitting president and you're still currently the vice president. So you try to distance yourself somewhat from that person, but at the same token, you've got to try to establish your loyalty still to that person and what the policies have been for the past 4 years, but then try to eke out your own kind of path going forward and what you're going to change, if anything, and how you're going to approach the top job, if you will. So I think that's something that she's been trying to do. Obviously, they set it up from the very, very beginning as the prosecutor versus the convicted felon, which is why I used that phraseology earlier. We also see, for example, that she's been going back to obviously a lot of the women's issues about abortion rights, about some people have even mentioned about Trump's age, that the immigration questions, about that Trump is only out for himself or for revenge against his enemies, throwing out obviously issues regarding January 6th and what might happen in terms of, if he's elected, will he pardon the rioters and things like that. So it's always, for me, unique when you see an incumbent vice president running for office, because they have to walk such a fine line between, respectful and supporting the president who they're still serving with, and trying to eke out their own unique path. And whether she's done that successfully or not, we'll find out in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, one other thing, I just want to put sort of a timestamp on when we're recording this program, because we've seen things happen so quickly throughout the entire presidential election process. We're actually recording 11 days prior to November 5th. So it's actually October 25th, just to put a time stamp on when Don and I are talking here as part of this program. So if something were to happen between now and then, you'll understand that we had no knowledge of it at the time we're recording this. All right, Don, now you have, former President Trump comes in. We talked about this before when we were talking about what he would need to talk about during the Republican National Convention. He has a record right? He's not someone who has never been president before. So what is he going to be focusing on? And what has he been focusing on in the last weeks of this campaign?
Well, I think that's a great point. He is going back to try to remember where things were 4 years ago, before President Biden and Vice President Harris took office, trying to say that things were better, that he will fight for you. And that kind of comes back to the first assassination attempt when, he was bloodied in the fight kind of thing. Because what's important for both sides in this campaign is that for the American public, what is most important is what people believe to be true, whether despite what the facts might say or the statistics or whatnot regarding the economy, regarding the border, regarding any of these issues, what people believe in their hearts is going to be much, much more important. So if he can go back and remember, like Ronald Reagan said in 1984, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I think that's going to be his biggest attempt to try to win a lot of voters who may have been a little bit hesitant to vote for his reelection 4 years ago. And they may say, the last 4 years, I don't know if the economy has been as good as it was, and this, that, and the other with inflation and housing, the immigration, the border issues, the foreign affairs issues that have been going on. Not to say that they're all President Biden's or Vice President Harris's fault, but nevertheless, when you're in office, they kind of become your baggage as well. So I think those are some of the things that former President Trump is really trying to do in terms of, saying that I will fight for you, that things were better. And then obviously, as Republicans often do talk about, as Democrats do on their side as well, about, that Vice President Harris is too far left, as Harris would say that Trump is too far right and things like that. And everyone right now, because the election is so close, despite all of the things that have been going on, it is still so close that everybody's trying to court every possible vote and find them wherever they can find them at different rallies. I mean, former President Trump is going to places, for example, like in urban centers where you really didn't really see that, because the Republicans in the past had kind of said, oh, well, that's kind of Democratic stronghold, so we're not going to go there. Well, he's been going there. You saw him at the football game last week or 2 weeks ago. He was at the drive-thru at McDonald's, for example, whereas you see Vice President Harris really trying to narrow down and bring back, if you will, quote unquote, if the polls are correct, black male voters, to the Democratic Party, and, focusing on maybe the suburbs a little bit more than Democrats had normally done, where they had kind of written those off to Republicans in the past as well. So they're really focused on trying to court both sides and get out there as best they can with social media, with the emphasis on, early voting, that even Republicans now are beginning to embrace a little bit more in both of those areas than maybe they did 4 years ago or 8 years ago or things like that. So I think it's interesting to see how they're really looking, and America is divided fairly evenly right now in terms of Democrats and Republicans, and that's why we're seeing this hotly contested race and the interesting kind of politics that results from that.
Yeah. Getting back to what some of the supporters of Vice President Harris have said concerning President Trump, they're using the phrase, and you touched upon it a little bit, a threat to democracy, harking back a little bit to January 6th and what happened there. We also heard that in some articles I've read that even some Republicans are a little concerned about, President Trump's rhetoric and the things he's been saying, and whether, he would follow through on that. And I think there's some Republicans who are saying, well, I'm concerned about the economy and immigration maybe being the top two issues, and I feel President Trump can better handle that. And in terms of that other stuff, the threat to democracy, well, they may be saying, well, that'll never happen because President Trump will have people there to sort of stop him. Like we heard during his first 4 years, there were some things that the president wanted to do that, some of his aides kind of got in the way. Do you feel that, are you hearing that as well in terms of some Republicans who may be reluctant to vote for President Trump based on some of the things he said?
Well, I think that's a very interesting comment, because I think there are Republicans who are probably hesitant for that reason. I think there are probably Democrats who are hesitant to vote for Harris for other reasons. And that's why with these polls showing everybody's being so close right now, it really makes me wonder if there are not some things going on that, for example, people saying that, well, they really are going to vote for Trump, let's say, but they don't necessarily say it to the pollsters because it's not politically correct, or because of the reasons that you just mentioned, because of the rhetoric going back and forth, or they're actually going to vote for Harris, but they're in a more of a red state, so that would be a little bit more dicey to say it to a pollster who's calling your home, for example, as well. I also, when you think about it from the polls, right now people are saying, oh, they're voting for Harris or they're voting for Trump for this reason or that reason. Will, in the long run, they hold Vice President Harris a little bit more responsible for, I don't want to say necessarily a cover up per se, but not, trying to pressure President Biden to withdraw sooner. So they actually could have had a regular primary process and perhaps chosen a candidate through that process, the regular process, as opposed to kind of how it happened after that CNN debate, for example. So will that be held against her in the long run? I don't know. Will January 6th, like you said, be held against Trump in the long run? The one thing, though, and this is something you and I talked about before we even take this, is the rhetoric in recent decades has gotten so much more harsh in terms of the name calling and things like that. Okay, that's one thing. But as we said before, it's at least in the past, you could say that I disagree with my opponent on this issue or that issue. But when, today it's now not only I disagree with my opponent on this, but my opponent also is a threat to democracy, or my opponent is a far left-wing radical kind of person. So things have gotten so much further that it's not just I disagree with the person, but now I question perhaps their patriotism, I question their cognitive abilities, among other things. So it's really gotten to a different point, and I think that's really, until we deal with those issues, I think that is we're going to see American politics continue to be this kind of very large divide between both parties.
As I mentioned, we're recording this on October 25th. In recent elections, there's been some issues that have come up late in the campaign. They're calling it an October surprise when it usually happens in October. Some events that could come up that really impacted, or some people think impacted, campaigns. You've done a little research in terms of the history of this. Talk a little bit about that. And, what comes to mind a lot is, the events of like 2016. There was a surprise coming up that may have impacted Hillary Clinton's run for the office. So talk about, the impact of something happening really late that could sway the election one way or another.
Right. Well, today we call them October surprises, but back in the day, the term was a roarback, which actually stemmed from the 1844 election, where there was a story that was publicized in New York State about then Democratic candidate for president, James K. Polk, who was a slaveholder. They said in the story that he actually branded his name on the back of every slave, and that was something done to discredit him. So it became a term roarback because the author's name was supposedly Roarback for this kind of political slander. So we've seen it happen, historically. I mean, the Irish were very important as a voting bloc in New York State, for example, in the 1880s. So we see in 1884, as one of these October surprises, for example, there was a speech given, and the Republican candidate happened to be there. And during the speech, the person said that the Democratic Party was the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Obviously, targeting and painting every single Democrat as being disloyal and drunks and so on and so forth, which the Irish saw was, hey, pointed at them. So they turned out in droves for the Democratic candidate that year. 4 years later, there was a bogus letter that was written, the Sackville West letter, that actually claimed supposedly that written by supposedly a British minister and a British representative, saying that the British preferred that Cleveland be elected because he would be more supportive of British policies and be more pro-British. Well, obviously the Irish, when they hear that, they don't want anyone being more pro-British, so they ended up voting against Cleveland. So the Republican won more votes, obviously, in 1888. So we see that going back and forth. And as you mentioned, we've seen it happen in the 1980s and the 90s, but 2016, most recently, we saw that, and it happened with both candidates, as you mentioned. Hillary Clinton, for example, there were a number of leaks that came from WikiLeaks, regarding, speeches and high-profile speeches that she had made to different banks and bankers, and that she had received debate questions early when she wasn't supposed to, obviously. That some of her stances were actually not exactly what she said that they were in terms of to the American public. Then, as you also got to just on the October 28th, I believe it was, that the FBI director, Comey, said that they were going to begin looking more into the emails regarding Hillary Clinton, which had already been an issue in the campaign, but they were found on another computer. Representative Weiner had been investigated and things like that, and they found more emails on his computer and tied to Hillary Clinton, and that brought up the whole email question again, right? A week, October 28th, so very shortly before the election. Similarly, in October, Donald Trump, the release of the Access Hollywood tape was also very damaging for him in terms of portraying him obviously as a very sexist individual and so on and so forth, and demeaning towards women. So both candidates, witnessed that. And will we see one coming up here in 2024? I mean, we're coming along here. I mean, you can always look and see, well, maybe this is something or maybe that's something, but will something have a huge impact? That will really be the big question going forward. So it's always interesting to kind of stay tuned.
Yeah. Another thing that has had impact in a number of elections are third-party candidates. We spoke before. I've actually, just be honest, I've actually already voted in person early where I live. And, a lot of people think, well, there's 2 candidates on the ballot. There isn't. In Massachusetts, I believe there are actually 6 candidates for president on the ballot. There are some representing other parties as an independent. Give us a little background on how third-party candidates have impacted presidential elections, and is there something that could impact this year's?
Well, I think it's interesting that the first third party to run, and a third party basically is just a party that's running that's not one of the major 2 parties in American government. That's basically what it is. And the first third party originated in 1832, the Anti-Mason Party. And these parties originate, and they usually are very much of a one-issue type of party, where they have a major concern that they're going to voice and try and bring to the American public. And we have seen third parties have an impact. For example, in 1848, a former president was running for president once again, Martin Van Buren, and he was running in New York State. And what's interesting is he ran as a free soil candidate, and that obviously brings up the slavery issue once again. And he was actually able to pull away enough Democratic voters to actually allow what was the Whig Party at the time to actually win the state, and that candidate actually was able to win the election because he won New York's electoral votes in that case. We saw, for example, in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, again, a former president running for election again, actually split from the Republican Party, ran as a third party, the Bull Moose Party. And he actually, for the first and only time in American history, actually had his third party actually won more electoral votes than one of the major parties. The Democratic Party won the majority and won the presidency, but Roosevelt finished second, and the Republican candidate, William Howard Taft, finished third. That's the only time we've ever seen that happen. Now, it's interesting that in 1992 and 96, Ross Perot ran, and I think he had a greater impact in the 1992 election. People always argue he pulled more votes away from George H.W. Bush, rather than obviously from Bill Clinton. And that actually may have helped Bill Clinton win the presidency in 1992. And Ralph Nader took over 3 million popular votes in 2000 that people argue took maybe votes away from Al Gore, which maybe helped George W. Bush win the election in 2000. So it's interesting that neither of those 2 candidates, however, in 1992, 96 for Perot, or 2000 and 2004 for Ralph Nader, even though they won millions or hundreds of thousands of popular votes, they did not win any electoral votes. The last time that a third party actually won any electoral votes in the United States was actually in 1968. And that's an interesting thing to keep in mind as well, that these third parties oftentimes can influence an election, not even by winning any electoral votes, but just by pulling away enough supporters from one candidate or one party or the other to kind of sway perhaps the state's electoral votes to go in this way or in one direction or the other. Now, in 2024, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we have obviously a Kennedy who was in the race until August 23rd. And Robert F. Kennedy is still on the ballot in several states. For example, in Rhode Island, he's still on the ballot in Rhode Island, as he is on many ballots across the country. So it'll be interesting to see. He was polling around 10% or so at the time when he withdrew from the race and then endorsed Trump. Will that have an impact? Will that help sway some voters to perhaps vote for Donald Trump? Will his name on the ballot be confusing for some people and then have an impact that way? It's going to be interesting to see how that may play out. But with a name, the name recognition of the Kennedy family, I think that will be very, very interesting to see how that plays out, long term. And perhaps the Republicans are, really pushing in these states where his name is still on the ballot to say, well, listen, he's no longer a viable candidate. He's endorsed our candidate, so please vote for Donald Trump instead, and so on and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out long term. But most recently, I think you can really see Perot and Nader had some interesting impacts in 1992 and 2000.
Yeah. All this leads to what will eventually happen after November 5th in terms of when the ballots are actually counted. One of the things that, we talked about in episode 1, one of the first things we talked about was, even though you're going to the polls and, you're making your intentions known for a particular presidential candidate, in effect, you're not necessarily voting for the candidate. You're voting for representatives who will vote for those candidates, called electors, in each state. So give us a review again on how that works.
All right, great. Yes, I mean, each state has one electoral vote for each representative or senator that state actually has. Now, what they've done also is they've awarded the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. So the total number of electoral votes are 538, with a majority being 270. So that's why on election night, you'll always see people looking at 270 and 270. But that doesn't mean that your popular vote doesn't matter, because your popular vote does matter, because it's the popular vote of a state which determines which party's electors, the Democrats, the Republicans, or any of the other parties, will actually go to the state capitol and vote in the Electoral College in December, which is actually the first Monday it meets after the second Wednesday. And the electors will meet and they will actually cast their votes for president and vice president. And whoever wins a majority will win the presidential election for president and VP. Now, what's interesting is, as you mentioned, Keith, that they are actually, when you actually are voting, you're technically voting for these electors. And actually, when you go in and look at the ballot, you'll see the electors for Harris, Trump, and so on and so forth. So they are the ones who are pledging that they will actually vote for the two particular, whatever candidate that you're choosing to vote for. And they're going to be, for example, in Massachusetts, has 9 representatives in the House and 2 U.S. senators. So Massachusetts has 11 electors or electoral votes. Well, what that means is that there are 11 different people from the Democratic Party. There are 11 people from the Republican Party and all the other parties that, if they win the popular vote in Massachusetts, it could be 1 vote, it could be 1,000 votes, it could be 3 million popular votes, it doesn't matter. All of the electoral votes will go to that candidate who wins the popular vote. So, whether it be a Democrat, Republican, and so on and so forth. However, because we use what's called in most states a winner-take-all system. In 2 states, however, they do it a little bit differently. More locally, Maine is one of these states, and Nebraska are only the 2 states that use what's called a district system, where what they do is they award their electoral votes a little bit differently. So what they do is they award 1 electoral vote for whoever wins the popular vote in each of the congressional districts. In Nebraska, there are 3. In Maine, there are 2. And then the remaining 2 votes, electoral votes, will be awarded based upon who wins the entire state popular vote. So that's why you see, for example, the candidates trying to campaign in these particular districts, especially in Maine and Nebraska, where you might say, okay, well, I might not have a chance in winning the entire state, but maybe I can pull away an electoral vote here, or one congressional district here and that electoral vote here or there. So that's what makes it a little bit more unique and interesting in those two states as well. Then what happens is the electors, as I said, vote for the two people when they come together in December. The votes are sealed and then they're sent to the US Capitol. And those votes will be counted on January 6th or 7th. This year, again, it will be on January 6th before a joint session of Congress. What's interesting is that it will be some tellers who will actually tally up the votes. And then the president of the Senate, but you know the president of the Senate better as the vice president of the United States, will then officially announce who has been elected president and vice president of the United States, which adds a little bit more drama this year because obviously the vice president is actually running for president herself. So it will make it a little bit more interesting and dramatic on January 6th.
Yeah.
Like we need more drama, you know.
Yeah. With the poll showing that nationwide, the nation is divided, pretty much split down the middle. However, when it comes to electoral counts, the individual states are not as split. That's why there's been a lot of talk in the news about the swing states, the 7 states, plus that one district in Nebraska that possibly could sway the election. And the candidates, as you said earlier, are really spending their time in those states and those districts because here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, generally the Democrats have been successful and likely to do so again. So they're not spending that much time. It's been interesting where the past few elections have focused on those 7 states.
Well, that's true. And this is not something new in American history. And that's where the Electoral College tends to overinflate a victory in the Electoral College vote, but not necessarily in the popular vote. And that's why, again, the popular vote matters. But it is also where the perception comes about that, well, my vote doesn't matter. Well, that's actually not the case, as I just explained, because obviously it's the popular vote that determines which set of electors will go. The other thing that might be said, though, is, well, my popular vote, if I happen to be a Republican living in Massachusetts, is overwhelmed by the tidal wave of Democratic votes each year. So therefore, I feel frustrated that I feel like my vote's not being counted. Well, quite frankly, it is being counted and it does have an impact. However, it is overwhelmed by the others. Just like, for example, perhaps in some other states, perhaps out west or in the South or other areas where a Democratic voter may feel that his or her vote is being overwhelmed by all the Republican votes that are coming in. So, but that doesn't, again, mean that it doesn't matter, it isn't important. But we've seen this happen right now. As you mentioned, we have the 7 states and the one, kind of congressional district in Nebraska. Well, we actually had this syndrome take place of swing states in the 1880s and 1890s, where literally we had 4 states that pretty much were the only ones up for grabs. And they were the ones that determined the elections. One of them happened to be the state that I spoke of a little while ago regarding the Irish vote in New York. So New York was one of them, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Indiana was the 4th one. So what you happened to see during that period was a lot of focus on those voters, a lot of focus on the issues that meant a lot to voters in those particular states. You had the dirty tricks, like I mentioned, with the Irish vote and other kinds of things happening. So it's interesting to see that things change, but sometimes they stay the same at the same time.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, we're heading closer to Election Day, November 5th. With the advent of early voting and mail ballot voting, which is relatively new. Some states have had it for a while, but in terms of nationwide, it's relatively new. In 2020, we didn't find out who the winner was of the election in terms of the media calling the winner until I believe 4 or 5 days later. I would anticipate with the race being this close, that'll be the same as well. We probably will not know a winner on the night of November 5th or early November 6th, correct?
Right. I mean, I think this one's going to go down to the wire again. And whether we have any recounts or court challenges, I think the drama will continue for days or perhaps hopefully not weeks after the election as well. But just keep in mind that the overarching drama of this election is still going to continue long after the votes have been counted and a winner is actually declared as well, because you still have former President Trump. His sentencing is scheduled for November 26th. And then on top of all that, you also have to keep in mind, too, that President Biden is leaving office. And that tends to be a time where they pardon a lot of individuals, whether it be political cronies or friends, or in some cases, relatives. So it makes you wonder that Hunter Biden whether he may pardon his son on the way out the door, like President Bill Clinton pardoned his brother for all of his brother's previous drug offenses and things like that. So, and again, George W. Bush did it. They all do it when they leave office. So it's not something just for Democrats or for a Republican. But I think it's interesting. It just adds a little bit more to this whole election mix. Will Trump be the president-elect at the time of his sentencing? How will this affect any pardons that Biden may dole out? Will that impact if it happens to be Vice President or now President-elect Harris, going to be taking office in about a month or so after, that usually that December timeline where they kind of do issue all those pardons, usually near the holidays, because they figure people are busy doing a lot of other things.
Yeah. Well, Don Kilguss, I really do appreciate your time throughout this entire series. You've been a wealth of information, and hopefully our viewers have had the opportunity to absorb some of that wealth. And hopefully they'll be able to make some informed decisions as they head to the ballot box between now and November 5th. I really appreciate your time. We'll talk again soon. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate everything you've done. It really has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
All right. And thank you for joining us here at FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Please make a point to vote on or before November 5th.